In the first segment of this lecture, we talked about the two general types of statistics, descriptive and inferential statistics. We also talked about samples and populations and how to describe samples and populations. Now we're going to talk about the characteristics of the variables that we measure. In particular, we're going to want to talk about operational definitions, the type of variable that we have or that we're working with, the distribution of the variables that we measure, and then also the measures of central tendency and variability. Now we won't get through all four of those for this particular lecture. We'll save the last two for later lectures, but we will talk about operational definitions and the type of variables that are being used. Now before we move on, we should talk about what a variable is. A variable is quite simply a property whose value can change. So in other words, if something changes, then it varies, and that's where variable comes from. Or something differs. If there's a difference between something, then there's a change or a variance. And so that is where we get the term variable. So a variable is a property whose value can change. So variables vary or they change. So something like height or weight. People's height changes depending on the person. People's height changes with their age. The same thing with weight. People's weight varies from day to day and across different people. Another variable might be the number of all people living in the U.S. And so the number of all people living in the U.S. changes across time. In other words, it varies. It is a variable. Another example might be the proportion of female engineers. That changes across time as well. Measures of personality differ from person to person. Measures of personality differs within people depending on the context. So for example, if you're typically an extroverted person, then your personality is probably going to be a little bit different at a football game than it will be at a funeral. So at a funeral, you won't be quite so extroverted or so outgoing. And so measures of personality change. They vary across people, but also within people. Another type of variable might be the number of defective garments. That may change from the styles of stitching you may use to the fabric or the material that's being used when you're creating those garments. All variables need to be operationally defined. And so what we mean by that is that if we're going to use it, or in other words, operate with it, then we need to define it in such a way that other researchers who come after us and who are studying the same constructs that we're studying are going to get similar measurements. And so when we say operational definition, what we're really saying is what are the procedures used to measure or manipulate a variable. And remember, a variable is a property whose values change. And so what are the procedures used to measure that variable? So really all we're doing is we're coming up with a working definition that tells other people how we measured a particular construct. So as a researcher, I may be interested in measuring people's weight. And so I need to operationally define how I calculated this weight measurement. Am I using pound units? Am I using ounces? Am I using tons? The type of measurement I use needs to be clearly defined. So does the process in which I gain that measurement. And so I may talk about weight as an operational definition as being measured by having a person stand on a scale in pound units, or in other words, a scale that measures in pound units. I may want to include in my operational definition also the time of day, because weight fluctuates with the time of day. I may indicate in my operational definition whether the person was standing with shoes on or with clothes on or whatever it may be, because that may change the weight measurement from person to person depending on the weight of the clothes that they're wearing. All those things may be in my operational definition. Again, the purpose of an operational definition is to let other people know how you're measuring the variable and in such a way that it can also be replicated by future researchers. Alright, so another operational definition might be that the U.S. population is measured by a Citizens Mailed 2010 Census Self-Report of the number of people living in his or her household. And so if I'm looking at census data, I want to know, well, how was this information gathered? There's several ways to gather census information. There's mailings, self-reports that are mailed directly to citizens who then fill it out and send it back. Census information is sometimes taken from people walking door to door. Sometimes it's through telephone interviews, and so there's many different ways that we can gain census information. So we need to define the way that we gathered the census information for our particular study. And that's what an operational definition is for. So we want to include the unit of measurement in an operational definition and then describe the procedures used to gather that information, because there's several different ways to measure the constructs of interest. Alright, and then a final example of an operational definition might be the proportion of women engineers is measured by the total number of men over the total number of men and women who self-report an engineer occupation based on a male 2010 census survey. And so, as you can guess, operational definitions can get very large. In other words, they can be very long and very descriptive, just to let other people know how we're getting the measurements that are within these variables. So how are we measuring or manipulating these variables? And that's what an operational definition is. We want to define how we're operating with the variables that we use for our research studies. So there are two things that need to be included in all operational definitions. You need to make sure that when you're asked to provide an operational definition, and I'll ask you to do this, so you'll have a particular research study and how it's measured is going to be fairly vague, and what I'll want you to do is to come up with an operational definition. And in your definition you need to include the units of measurement, so how are we measuring this particular construct, and then also you need to describe the procedures needed to measure that particular construct. So in other words, you want to be specific enough to allow for easy replication. Now when I ask you to give operational definitions, I'm not looking for a half-page or a full-page definition, just something in 2 to 3 sentences that tells me you know what an operational definition is, and that you know what an operational definition includes. And so in particular, it should include the units of measurement, and then enough detail of the procedures for that variable and how it's measured to allow for easy replication. And if you cover those two things in the operational definitions that you give me on exams or handouts or classwork or whatever it may be, then you'll get full credit for that operational definition. So again, make sure you include the measurement, the units of the measurement, and then also make sure you include a procedure that's specific enough to allow for replication.